You can start now, Anna.
Oh, sorry. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our City Talks. This is our second event. It's a collaboration between the City of Hobart and the University of Tasmania. And this collaboration is all about trying to inspire ideas and innovation for Hobart's future. For this City Talk, we're also joined with our special partner, Open House Hobart, who are operating their annual event in Hobart at the moment. And we're all here to discuss a really interesting topic, the power of preservation, which is the economic value that heritage creates for Hobart. My name is Anna Reynolds. I'm the Lord Mayor of Hobart, and I will be moderating the discussion today. But firstly, in recognition of the deep history and culture of this place, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land upon which we're meeting, the Palawa people of Tasmania. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. Your microphone, camera, and chat function and your raised hand function have all been disabled so that our speakers are not interrupted. But we do encourage you to ask questions, and this can be done at any time by typing them into the Q&A function, which you'll see on the bottom of your screens. A selection of these will be answered during the Q&A session towards the end of the presentations. And finally, this lecture, this forum is being recorded and it will be accessible later on both YouTube and SoundCloud. For many people, Hobart's heritage is central to our identity. It's what sets us apart. But as we grow, heritage is becoming a more contested idea. Some people are of the view that too much protection of heritage holds us back. Is heritage a drag to economic momentum? Does respect for heritage mean that modern building designs next door become uneconomic? How undermined does a heritage streetscape have to become before it affects a city's brand? These are all really interesting questions, and they're not questions that are unique to Hobart. Many cities have debated these problems, and they have been examined by hundreds of experts and debated by many people with an interest and expertise in heritage. And we're very lucky that today, to help us have this discussion, we have some expert observers here to help us discuss some of these issues. Our extra special guest is Donovan Rypkema, and he's the president of Heritage Strategies International. Donovan is joining us from the US, and it's very early in the morning, so I want to especially thank Donovan for joining us. Donovan has been working in between heritage conservation and economic development for many, many years and been on assignments in over 50 countries. His clients have included the World Bank, the European Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Council of Europe, and the United Nations Development Programme. Donovan is a member of the board of directors of the Global Urban Development. He's a member of the International Council on Monuments and Sites, or ICMOS, and the International Scientific Committee on the Economics of Conservation, a former member of the Senior Advisory Board of the Global Heritage Fund. Now, after Donovan has spoken today, I will be in conversation with two other very special guests. Lucy Burke-Smith is a registered architect based in Hobart with specialist experience in built heritage and postgraduate qualifications in heritage conservation. She has more than 17 years experience in the management and delivery of complex, large-scale conservation projects. During her extensive career in government, Lucy was responsible for ensuring quality, design and conservation outcomes for the significant heritage precinct of the Rocks in Sydney and for the Port Arthur heritage historic sites. Also joining us is Peter Lovell. He is a leading heritage consultant in Australia with more than 39 years of professional practice. He is a founding director of Lovell Chen, which is a firm that leads the field in design and development in heritage contexts. As an active participant in his profession, Peter regularly contributes through conference papers, lectures and speaking engagements, as well as membership of heritage committees and organisations. Peter is an honorary fellow of the Australian Institute of Architects and a long-standing and past executive member of ICOMOS. So it's now my great pleasure to invite Donovan to speak on the power of presentation. Thank you, Donovan.
Thank you very much, Lord Mayor. And I am so happy to be back in Hobart for my second time. The first time didn't have to be virtual, but maybe there'll be a third time where I can walk the streets. So thank you very much for having me. I want to talk about this way that that heritage contributes to the economy, and there's really four ways. It can do it directly, things like the jobs that the restoration process creates; indirectly, the goods and services that are created so that conservation can take place; functionally, how heritage buildings are used, and then providing the context. But for the full economic benefit of heritage conservation to be seen, there's really two requirements that have to be met. First of all, we have to think beyond the monument. Monuments are very important, but monuments are just a part of heritage. Often the vernacular, the streetscape, the broader, less monumental heritage buildings is where we really achieve the economic benefit. Then second, and it really is a primary focus of my short remarks this morning, is this concept of adaptive reuse. There really has to be a commitment to this concept that over time, buildings, heritage, including heritage buildings, can be reused. Our firm that does international work is called Heritage Strategies International, but our companion firm that does work exclusively in the U.S. is called Place Economics. And much of our work is this measuring of the economic impact, economic and other impacts of heritage conservation in various states and cities around the U.S. And I put this up in that we have great clients, and almost always they allow us, once the report is done, to post that. So I'm going to share some factoids from some of these reports today, but I'd encourage you, if you're interested, to go to our website. It's a tab called Resources, and download and read any of these studies that might. So before I start, I want to start with a kind of geeky economics concept, and that's called the concept of revealed preference. So this little girl, we could have asked her what kind of ice cream she prefers, but the alternative is to simply let her choose. She's the marketplace. Let her choose, which ice cream she wants to have. Well, that's really what revealed preference is in economics. We don't poll people. We literally see what the marketplace is telling us about the market's preference for heritage conservation. And I want to start with this. Buildings get torn down. Well, why do buildings get torn down? Well, a few of them we lose to natural causes. There's a flood or a fire or a hurricane or typhoon. But the vast majority of buildings that are torn down are consciously done so. There actually aren't very many buildings that fall down. The vast majority of buildings that are lost are torn down, and they're torn down on purpose. Well, why? Why are they torn down on purpose? Well, many of them are torn down because of this concept, a real concept called functional obsolescence. My technical background actually is in real estate economics, real estate appraisal, and there is such a thing as functional obsolescence. It's not a made-up thing. And functional obsolescence can exist in these situations: when the use for which a building was built no longer exists, when the use for which a building was built no longer exists in that form, like this 4-story industrial building in the northeast of the U.S. We still need industrial manufacturing buildings, but they're built on the horizontal. They're not built as 4 stories. So there's an example of a building. We still need those buildings, but not in that form. Sometimes the building is functionally obsolete when the systems are gone, the heating or the air conditioning or electrical don't meet current needs, or sometimes when the spatial configuration of the building is simply extremely inefficient. Well, all of those can cause a building to be functionally obsolete. And one response to a functionally obsolete building is demolition. We no longer have a functionally obsolete building, but in fact, the economic and environmental and often the social and cultural responsible response to functional obsolescence is adaptive reuse. Adaptive reuse is really reinserting into a building a function, a utility that has been lost. And this has consequences when we make that decision for adaptive reuse. The city, I live in Washington, D.C., about 30 miles north of where I live is the city of Baltimore, Maryland. One of those kind of northeast cities in the U.S. that's been declining in population, but has had a great degree of investment in heritage buildings. And in a recent study we did in Baltimore, every time $1 million is spent on rehabilitating an historic building in Baltimore, adaptively reusing the building, there's 5.7 direct jobs and another almost 3 indirect jobs, with labor income of $400,000 for direct jobs and another $172,000 for indirect jobs. So this activity is labor intensive, generates considerable local impact. In fact, over the U.S., every time there's 100 new jobs or 100 jobs created in new construction, there's 135 jobs created somewhere else in the economy, and that's wonderful. But every time there's 100 jobs created in rehabilitation, 186 jobs are created elsewhere in the economy. So it's this impact, this labor intensity that generates this spin-off effect of rehabilitation activity. Those same jobs, those $100 in labor income for new construction creates $145 in labor income elsewhere in the economy, but $100 in labor income from rehabilitation is $174 in labor income elsewhere. So it's not that we shouldn't have new buildings, of course we do, but dollar for dollar, there's lots more local economic impact with rehabilitation than in new construction. One of the impacts of adaptive reuse is their catalytic impact on the areas around them. A few years ago, we did a study on the state tax credit in the state of Louisiana. Louisiana is where New Orleans, one of the great historic cities in America, is. And here is a building, the 1950s automobile dealership that had sat vacant for years in New Orleans, and that was redeveloped as a grocery market. Well, look at the chart is of building permits, building construction activities in the immediate area around this building. 2004 was just right after Katrina, the hurricane. And what you can see is for 8 years, literally nothing happened in Smithton, nothing happened. And then this building took place, followed by $140 million of new construction, most of it new buildings. We talked to every developer of those buildings, and every one of them said the only reason we were willing to make this investment was because the adaptive reuse of the Rouse's market made sense, changed the context of the neighborhood to make it make sense. Again, in Baltimore, just to the north, here is a city that in fact has been losing population for years. There was the redevelopment of this former industrial building onto Miller's Court, a residential property focused primarily on teachers, other public employees. Well, what happened after the redevelopment of Miller's Court, not only were there lots more building activity right in the same area, but in the neighborhood, the population grew while the population of the city continued to decline. So this catalytic impact of heritage. Another of the great American historic cities is Savannah. Savannah, Georgia. And within Savannah, there's an educational institution called the Savannah College of Art and Design. And when SCAD first opened, they made the decision, we're not going to have a campus in a traditional sense. What we're going to do is we're going to go and buy every building in town that nobody wants. Schoolhouses, jails, armories, buildings, white elephant buildings that nobody wants. And we're going to use those as our classroom. So a few years ago, we tracked what happened. SCAD acquired a building, redeveloped it. What happened to property values around, not the building itself, 500 feet around that building? And you can see what's happening is that the properties in every instance, in that halo effect of that adaptive reuse project, in fact, property values greater than the rate of property change in the city as a whole. And this also has kind of economics once removed. It has environmental impact. A few years ago, an investment banker teamed up with a environmental economist, and the two of them set up framework that we frankly have stolen to measure the difference environmentally of the decision to readopt an historic building, reuse it, or go to the edge of town and build a new 40, and their model was a 40,000 square foot industrial building. And they measured the differences, environmental differences of those two choices. And we've then taken their model when we've looked at buildings. So here is a wonderful late 19th century building in Providence, Rhode Island. And the decision to adaptively reuse that building rather than build new means there was a reduction of vehicle miles traveled of 200,000 miles, a reduction of CO2, travel-related CO2. It's like taking something like 26 or 28 cars off the road. 4.5 acres of land, greenfield, did not have to be used because of their adaptive reuse. A lowered runoff. 2,000 tons of stuff did not go to the landfill because of that decision. And infrastructure costs saved between $400,000 and $600,000. Well, I don't care if your motivation in the political world is to save the environment or to save public tax dollars, whichever your choice is. In fact, the adaptive reuse of heritage buildings advances that cause. In Los Angeles, where we've released a study earlier this year, a quarter of everything that goes into the landfill is from construction debris, and 90% of that is from demolition. Well, all over the world, and I'm sure it's true in Tasmania, that solid waste landfills are increasingly expensive, both in money and environmental quality. Well, just the demolition of a small 2,000 square foot house in Los Angeles generates 295 cubic yards of stuff, 84 tons of stuff that goes into the landfill. Nashville, a great music center in Tennessee, in the States, is the heritage areas in Nashville only represent 3% of all jobs, but in terms of job growth, in terms of startup jobs, in terms of small jobs, that's where extraordinary pattern of growth. And that's this issue of revealed preference. Those kinds of businesses are revealing their preference to be in heritage areas. You can love New York or you can hate New York, but nobody can argue it's not one of the most creative places in the world. So in a study we've done earlier this year in the impacts of preservation in the city of New York, we identified these creative class jobs. And in the U.S. system of record keeping, those fall in the arts, entertainment, and recreation fields. In Manhattan, which everybody thinks about New York as Manhattan, historic areas have 12.5% of the jobs, but 24%, 23.5% of the arts, entertainment, these creative class jobs. If you take the whole of the city, 85 boroughs of it, that's 8.5% of the jobs in these heritage areas, but almost 20% of these creative class workers revealing a preference to be in heritage areas. But it doesn't have to be a place like New York. Here in Indianapolis, a kind of, or more ordinary city in the middle of the country, the heritage areas are only about 3.5% of the land area, about 16% of the jobs. But in those knowledge worker jobs, professional, scientific, and technical services, 28% of those jobs work for companies that chose to be in the heritage areas. Again, back to New York, the city as a whole, 8.5% of all jobs, 10% of those professional, scientific, and technical services, 15% of the information jobs in heritage areas, mostly in adaptive reuse buildings. In fact, the giants of the cutting edge industries, and we refer to them here as the FANG industries, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google, every one of those giants, and there's a huge emerging tech industry in New York City, all of those in the last year have either acquired and rotated or long-term leases in heritage buildings in the city. So the idea that somehow the 21st century economy can't be accommodated in heritage buildings, simply wrong. And these giants of the industry, in fact, have demonstrated that. In Los Angeles, they have a category of what they call loft creative buildings. And these are almost by definition adaptive reuse projects, industrial or warehouse buildings that have been converted. And one of the great measurements that the real estate industry uses is a vacancy. Well, so we looked at these category of buildings that were built prior to 1960 and then subsequent. Well, the vacancy was 5 points less in those older heritage buildings that have been converted to loft creative buildings. A couple of years ago, and again, your two great Australian heritage experts may have a different perspective on this, but we did a survey of American heritage conservation professionals and asked which were most important in adaptive reuse projects. The top of the list was the significant architectural features of the building's exterior. And after that was new use that revitalizes the neighborhood. And that's a major impact of heritage adaptive reuse. So then there's also, and I'll finish with this, a whole range of economic impacts of heritage that are really beyond simply adaptive reuse. I just wanted to mention a property value premium. We've seen foreclosure mitigation in heritage areas versus the rest of the city, density at a human scale, tax generation, Lord Mayor, demographic diversity, walkability, proximity to parks and public amenities, heritage tourism, neighborhood stability, and many more. And again, encourage you to go and look at some of that research to see what we found. Thank you so much for letting me come to Hobart this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donovan. And there will be an opportunity to ask questions for Donovan, and he'll obviously be part of our discussion now. I guess if I could just start by asking Lucy and then Peter for your reflections on Donovan's talk, and in particular what you think is the most important takeout for the City of Hobart from the points raised by Donovan.
Sorry, thank you, Anna, and thank you, Donovan, for the international insight as well. I guess there are many similarities to what we see with, I guess, broader precinct management and place making here in Australia and within significant cultural landscapes and cities such as Hobart as well. And it's interesting to see that there are several pieces to the puzzle, and there's no one piece that sort of takes precedent or makes a greater contribution to the other. And so in that regard, I think it's really important that these sorts of conversations are had through broader industry and broader professional discourse as well, because there's so many, I guess, different contributions that can ensure successes and outcomes. So I guess that was my overall reflection on the talk, but the statistics are really persuasive. So thank you for those.
Peter, what were your thoughts?
Donovan, thank you also. I think it was fascinating and always terrific to get an international insight into these things. It's interesting in that cities vary so much, and Hobart is a very particular case. I think Hobart is a city that thrives on all of those cultural things to do with heritage, to do with arts, to do with a place that is enjoyable, aspirational, all of those things. And I think that it is the nuances of each place that is interesting when you take your examples and you say, well, what is the fit in Hobart? I would reflect that one of the challenges I would perceive for Hobart is a tension between a desire to preserve in a pure sense, if you like, to really restore, versus a desire to adapt and reuse and accommodate change. And I think what is interesting about the American examples is that the Main Street examples are very much ones that in fact do accommodate, I would perceive, a greater breadth of adaptive change. Whereas I think Hobart, the precious aspect of Hobart is in a way the purity of some of the built form. And for me, in reflecting on your talk and Hobart, it is this dilemma in heritage, I think, between the thing you pointed out, this desire of many in the community to see historic buildings preserved, literally, versus the desire and the need to make them viable and to make them economic and perform. And so that I think that's the interesting tension. And it's the one that I'd be interested in, Anna, your views and Hobart's views on this. But that's where I think the challenge is in many ways.
And it was interesting to see that a lot of the photographs that Donovan you had were of cityscapes that have a very different building typology. And so expanding on what Peter was mentioning about, the fit for the place, we've got an extraordinary collection of colonial buildings throughout Hobart. And sometimes the challenge is about finding, compatible uses, which, you're seeking to align a use to a place as opposed to the other way around. And so, it's not exclusively the case, but it's often the case that larger, more robust buildings can take a wider range of alternate uses. And so there is a fine grain consideration with, I guess, the context and history of the building stock that does present a unique challenge to Hobart and to other areas around Australia as well, but to Hobart more specifically.
Lord Mayor, can I just jump in on two of those
Yes,
things?
please.
I absolutely understand that this tension between really wanting to restore and preserve it and to adapt and reuse it, and I think that's almost a building by building decision. But here's the reality: the greater that it falls on the purity and restoration side, the greater the public resources are that have to go in there. The greater the adaptive reuse and adaptation, the more opportunity for private resources to be attracted there. And that's again, lots of things in public decisions are that way, but that's what needs to be recognized. If we want to keep the purity, we almost definitionally are going to have a greater public participation in that process. On the second issue, and I'm not a design person at all, Lucy, so I absolutely understand that challenge. I have a good friend who was the contractor on the first historic preservation project I ever did, and has a 40-year success story of adaptively reusing historic buildings, and always makes money at it. And I saw him a few years ago and said, how do you do that? I mean, nobody makes money every time. He said, the answer is simple. You let the building tell you what it wants to be. That you don't want to try to impose your will on the building. You step back and let the building describe what it wants to be. And said, if you make those decisions, then you don't make kind of stupid things about, oh, this room would work better if the wall were 6 inches different. You, in fact, just let the building accommodate what you're trying to do.
And I think that is a tension in Australian cities generally, but also in Hobart, is that almost everyone would agree that we want to keep facades, and the more of a streetscape you can keep, the better. But when it comes to the retaining of the interior elements of a heritage building, or the gardens, or every single part of the streetscape, I think that's where it can get more difficult in terms of whether people think it's worth the effort, and where there can be a departure between a developer who might say, look, I just, I have to change the internal part of this quite dramatically if I'm going to make this economic. So have you got any thoughts about that tension, about the feedback we get is that doing up heritage buildings is a more expensive labour of love for a developer? And Donovan, I think you're showing that in a way that there's obviously more jobs because there's more money having to be spent on the adaptive reuse. So how do we sort of deal with that tension of it's too costly for me to really care for this building and do it up in the way that you'd like us to?
Well, I come from the real estate development world. So I love real estate developers, but I always take, when they say I can't do it, I always take that, frankly, with a grain of salt. And second, and again, you have two great examples here. Never, ever, my advice to developers in the U.S. is never, ever try to do an historic building with not using an architect and a general contractor who have successfully done it before. That the horror stories of cost always come because you either had an architect or a general contractor who didn't know what the hell they were doing. Then as number one. Number two is that while this exterior appearance is important, and again, I know there's several examples actually in Perth of this and maybe elsewhere in Australia, I'm absolutely appalled, frankly, and we do way too much of it, of the U.S., this facadomy, where the only thing you keep is the front of the building. I mean, that's Halloween mask preservation. That's not preservation. And then that just gets ridiculously expensive. As to the overall cost, yeah, there's some examples of ridiculously expensive things, but they're the exception, at least in our experience. That one of the few areas where I have some technical knowledge is the comparative costs of rehabilitation and new construction. That you can always do something, build something new cheaper than you do quality rehabilitation. But when quality is part of the equation, heritage conservation is always going to be a competitive alternative. That might be 5% less, might be 10% more, but it's not 200% more, it just isn't. And this issue, and I didn't do a very good job of explaining it, because this issue about job creation is not because it costs more. It is because the same amount of money spent, a greater share goes to labor. It's a kind of rule of thumb. In the US, new construction will half the money go to labor, half will go to materials. For rehabilitation, 30 to 40% will be in materials, 60 to 70% will be in labor. So the same amount of money spent, in fact, is lots more job creation.
Great, thank you. So Peter, you work with a lot of developers who are looking to use and adapt heritage buildings. What's a common concern that they have, or what are some of the issues that they are confronting before they make the decision to invest in a heritage building?
I think, Anna, most of the clients we deal with are attracted to heritage buildings for all the reasons everyone is. It is a key advantage, if you like, in a development compared to a greenfield site. So that I think, as Donovan was saying, there are a lot of clients who have a real interest in taking on heritage buildings. The challenges are, though, significant, and the challenges increasingly we're finding are to do with building regulations, to do with compliances. Really, one of the big challenges, the building regulations get harder and harder to deal with, and the need to comply with earthquake codes, with all sorts of things, make it pretty tough on occasions. And I think that, but notwithstanding, there is a real appetite for it. And I think in Melbourne, there certainly is, and I think in Hobart there is. One of the things I'd reflect on is, I think it's interesting, Donovan, your comment about the subtlety of it's always possible to do it more cheaply to build new if you want to build a basic building. Yes. And I think perhaps the gap is where government needs to look again at incentives. It needs to look again, how do you make that difference for a building owner? Whether it's a land tax relief, it's a rate relief, it's a tax deductibility for the work, or you put some social housing into it. And I think it's some subtle tweaks in the process that make it economically work. And it is tough in a building industry that is geared to new build, getting the right builder to do adaptation work. I think, Donovan, you're dead right. The wrong builder will kill you, the right builder will deliver. And there are things like that, Anna, where I think that government could step in and actually help. I think also procedurally, the fast tracking of process. I think that too often heritage projects are frowned upon because it takes years to get approval, and it's contested, and it's tough, and it's hard work. And I think that certainly in a Victorian context, and I'm sure elsewhere, people look at it and say, I just don't want to spend 12 months in a process to get a planning approval. I need to have some ability to get this to work more efficiently. And I think that's also a factor that I would see. So that I think there are many people out there who are keen, but I think there needs to be a shift here and a bit of a rethinking. And I suspect probably Tasmania, Hobart's not dissimilar to Melbourne and Victoria, the same issues that we confront here. But that'd be my reflection on it.
Perhaps Lucy and Donovan, if you could just reflect on what you know of cities that are offering, cities or states that are offering incentives, and which sort of incentive, or whether it is incentives or whether it's just education and capacity building in the local building sector that actually spurs more of this heritage reuse. Lucy, have you seen a city in Australia do it particularly well? And Donovan, maybe if you could reflect on where you've seen best practice in terms of city, not so much at federal level, but city or state incentives or policies that really encourage the adaptive reuse.
I think the notion of incentives is an interesting one, and it's not something that we have broadly applied down here in Hobart. And you can see that there are other sort of strategies that really do, I guess, afford that incentivisation. But it essentially comes down to how are you incentivising investment? And while I'm not an economist or a placemaker, there are international and local models such as, heritage lottery funding and heritage action zones, in New South Wales and in Sydney, more specifically, heritage floor space considerations and developer contributions as well. And I think those sorts of things are important carrots. But as Peter says, the interest is there for investment such as that into heritage places. I guess as it comes to the bigger picture of city shaping, it's really important to identify that, you've got a spectrum of assets that may be government owned or privately owned, but that in city shaping and placemaking, it really comes down to the government not only to incentivise development, but I guess to have a bit of a vision as to what that development's going to look like, and to be leaders in identifying underutilised places or precincts and visions for those places and precincts. And I think from that, there's a broader conversation about changing, considerations for planning schemes, understanding well market forces and community demands. As Donovan was saying, what was the term used? Functional obsolescence. I quite like that one, Donovan. But it's that sort of high vision that needs to run in parallel with the investment. And I guess some hard decisions about, what government's contribution is going to be to that as well. So not just with regard to policy and incentives, but what government's investment is going to be.
Mm.
A lot of the work that our firm does is on this incentives issue. And I'm not at all a kind of flag-waving American exceptionalism guy. However, the singularly best incentive program in the world is one that's in the federal U.S. tax law. And that is, if you restore a historic building meeting the appropriate tests, you get a 20% tax credit. That means I spend $1 million rehabilitating a historic building, I get a $200,000 offset, dollar for dollar offset of $200,000 of income taxes that I would otherwise have to pay. It is extraordinarily effective. And 35 states have added a state component to offset state tax credits. They kind of layer, and it's extraordinarily impactful. So it absolutely works. And just, thousands of projects a year are done using those programs. I will say, however, and again, we're just finishing up a project for Abu Dhabi's culture ministry for incentives for modern heritage there. And what we've really looked is that rarely is a single incentive sufficient, that you really need a kind of layering of different kinds of incentives for sometimes different kinds of buildings, different kinds of situations. So there's not a kind of, single big fix and it works all. But I have a public policy justification for that. So when you first raise incentives, the reaction will be, why do we want to make rich developers richer? That is not the purpose of incentives. If you think about the values of heritage, you have the economic value that accrues to whoever owns the building, but there's social and cultural, environmental and symbolic and political and a whole range, educational, whole range of values that heritage represents. But the building owner is not the recipient of those. The citizens of Hobart or Tasmania or the world, generations that aren't even born yet, are the recipients of those values. And so the public policy justification for incentives is to say, we're not putting money in the pocket of this developer. We, in fact, are making a contribution towards the values that the rest of us are receiving, that we're asking this guy to spend the money to do the building, but it's going to create values that the rest of us accrue. And that's the justification for those kind of incentives. But I also believe, and it's what kind of Lucy suggests, is that incentives are not good if you only have carrots. You need the carrots, you need the sticks, and you need the vision within which to put those incentives.
Okay, we're going to now move to some of the questions that we're getting from the audience. So we're getting quite a lot, but I'll just, a few of them are very Hobart specific, which might be challenging, but I'll go to a more general one, which is really asking about does this historic adaptation restrict the involvement of the less financially resourced members of the population? I guess really he says in his question, you may wish to rephrase this. I guess what he's asking is the gentrification of heritage areas, and whether all of this economic benefit you're talking about is really also about saying that an area has become gentrified and is therefore excluding certain people of the population and making an area unaffordable to live in. And I guess this is relevant in places like Hobart, because our most beautiful heritage suburbs generally are the ones that have more expensive real estate and are more appealing for visitor accommodation, and so they are harder to get those affordable rentals. Would anyone like to pick up on how we does heritage protection mean gentrification, and how do we tackle that?
That's a very major issue, and I'd have to say it's a very interesting one. I mean, I would reflect in 40 years of doing this that my observation of heritage protection is there is inevitably an element of it being associated with gentrification. And I think in a way, the examples Donovan said, where you adapt and restore a building and suddenly you transform a neighborhood, it becomes an attractor. But balanced against that, I think the Victorian experience on providing modest incentive by way of dollars to people in towns and smaller country towns and villages and places, inner suburbs, has in fact hugely shifted the ability for those who aren't necessarily well-to-do to look after, preserve in a quite gentle way without necessarily triggering the process of wholesale gentrification. So I don't think you'll ever stop gentrification. You will inevitably, it occurs. But I do think you can assist many, many people and not simply see that happening. And I was involved in a scheme in Queenscliff in Victoria where we used to be able to give out $5,000 or $10,000 just for someone to redo their picket fence, redo their veranda, whatever it was. It was a very low-key thing, but it made a huge difference. And so I think there are ways to manage it and not see it as a simply upwardly mobile outcome.
Okay, we've got quite a few comments more than questions. I do have a question here about how important is it to restrain outside foreign developers from coming to Hobart trying to invest in massive building glass concrete high-rise towers? So I guess how, in some ways that's a question about how much will a precinct be undermined by a few very incongruous buildings, or can a place like Hobart protect its heritage precincts but still have some quite significant modern buildings interspersed in between? Who'd like to take that on?
I guess as the
Lucy.
local, I'll offer to take that one on, but I think the response is probably universal in that, we need to have confidence on and rely in the rigour and continual review of our planning schemes and our state-based heritage acts to ensure that they're delivering outcomes that not only protect but also enhance heritage values for the community more broadly. So I don't think it's necessarily so much about who's making the investment, but about the outcome. And I think one of the greatest things that we can do as a community is to advocate for a quality of design that is consummate with and appropriate for a city as significant internationally as ours is. It is really unique, and we are in a position to demand that the design responses within the urban context make an enduring contribution to the legacy of the place.
Mm. Yeah, Donovan, have you got any thoughts about these places that we're not Florence, we're not Venice, we're not Lisbon? In some ways, some of the streetscapes have been undermined over certain decades, and so there's some places that have a very protected street view, and some places that don't. And how do you feel about, or how do you see cities that have the mix of the old and the new, finding the balance that still retains that economic value of the heritage streetscapes you're talking about?
Well, I think that the best, the kind of end of the bell curve, the Florence of the world, but those are really the exceptions. I think that most cities, in fact, and I think the real strength of heritage cities is that they do evolve over time, that they are not fixed in place, embedded in amber, never to change. They evolve over time, and they should. But I think that buildings ought to be like human beings, and that is to be respectful to their neighbors. And that's the issue. I think there's plenty of great examples from around the world of well-designed, well-scaled, appropriate new construction within the context of heritage buildings. But when it's a 30-story building next to a block of 4-story buildings, in fact, it's rude. It's screaming all that. That's what it's doing. It's like a neighbor who screams 100% of the time. That's simply disrespectful. And the other thing about that is this old real estate cliche that the three most important things are location, location, location. But what that's really saying is that the value of a given piece of real estate does not emerge from within the four walls and the roof. The economic value of real estate comes from its context. That's where it comes from. You build that same building in the middle of Antarctica, it's going to have zero economic value. It's not because of the money spent building the building. It is that context that gives it value. And the underlying purpose of land use controls in general and heritage precinct regulations in particular is to protect the context from which that value emerges. And I don't particularly care if it's your most kind of precious, pristine neighborhood or one of more vernacular mixed-use buildings. In all of those cases, they ought to be saying that the additions ought to add and not detract from what we have here. And that means designing and building respectable buildings.
Thank you. Peter, I'm wondering what you think about this issue of scale and how important is scale in ensuring that new and old can sit comfortably together and not be the sort of annoying neighbour that Donovan's describing.
I think, Anna, scale is hugely important, and I would totally agree with Donovan in that fundamental proposition of height and low scale versus tall scale. But I would reflect that in the capital cities of Australia, you do in fact get this juxtaposition. You do get 2-story heritage buildings and 30-story towers, and you do in American cities, you do in cities all over the world. Australia, though, interestingly, does in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, to a degree Perth, has this as a particular characteristic, I think, of our capital cities, this interface. I think Hobart is different, and I find going to Hobart challenging about this issue because I think by and large, tall buildings in Hobart have not been very successful. They've not produced a city that is improved. And I think, taking Lucy's point, it is about design, it is about the subtlety of how it's done. And I think Hobart's at a real turning point. I think it's at a very critical point, whether it accommodates now a significant scale of development and changes, or whether it says, no, we are a city that we want to maintain at a lower scale as a point of differentiation almost. And I think it is a fundamental decision for the council, I suspect, and the planners to say, where do we see Hobart in a decade? And what scale and what height do we see? Because the pressure will be there to build 10, 20, 30-story buildings at the end of the day. And it's whether you make a key decision here. So I accept that it is challenging. I think it happens. Melbourne is a city of contrasts in that sense. It has been for decades now. But Hobart, I think, is very special. It's unique in the Australian context, certainly. And I think it's a real challenge.
Thank you. I've got a comment here. Hobart may not be Florence. Hobart is the most wonderful confluence of the natural and built environment. Tourists from Sydney and Melbourne appreciate this. Tasmanians take it for granted. Hobart needs to sell the qualities of the city to its demographic. New builds need to contribute to the livable quality of this city. So I think we'd all probably be in furious agreement with that comment. But I'm just interested in what the panel, what they know of Hobart, do they think is special about the heritage of Hobart?
I think it for me, Anna, to jump in first as the non-Tasmanian here, or one of the non-Tasmanians, it is the ability to appreciate history almost at every corner of the town. So if I walk about Hobart, and almost anywhere I'm in that central area of Hobart, you have an absolute appreciation of the age and history and the dimension of it. The fine grain Lucy commented on, I think it is a beautifully fine grained city in many respects. And it is that sense for me of a very tangible understanding of the remoteness of it, of the early settlement of that engagement. So, and so Sullivan's Cove, I think it has those qualities. Sydney and the Rocks, in a way, you get it, but frankly, the Rocks is now a tourist town full on and has been for decades. Hobart isn't that. Hobart's sort of maintained a legitimacy, a reality to it. And so for me, it's appreciating that quality of the place. And I think for me, probably the challenge is what do you do with the 20th century in Hobart in what's been built and what happens in the 21st century. The 19th century is fantastic, but but it's not to stop development. I think equally Mona and the contributions that have come are fantastic too, and are very, very important. So sorry, I've
Thank you.
used up time, but that's
that's all right. Lucy, just a few quick thoughts on what you think's the special about Hobart's heritage.
I think you hear a lot of people talking about Hobart having a really strong sense of place, and I find that, and like Petty, I find myself wandering around seeing that there are so many discernible layers of history in the built environment. Some speak, probably a little more authentically to who Hobartians and Tasmanians would